Hello, I'm Miss Kilburn Bond. In this video I'm going to talk to you about the poem The Emigree by Rumens. And before we go any further, if you haven't got a copy of the poem in front of you now, it'd be really helpful if you had that, maybe some highlighters, a pen, pencil, so that you can annotate the poem as we go through it. The learning objectives of the video are to help you with the 3 assessment objectives that you're going to be assessed on when you write about this poem in an exam. So first of all, assessment objective 1 is simply to help you be able to read and understand the events, the themes and the tone of the poem. Then moving on to assessment objective 2, I'm hoping to help you explore and analyse the effect of language, form and structure in the poem so you can explain how the poet's choices make meaning. And then finally, assessment objective 3, to explore the contextual factors and how these might help us to understand its meaning. So that's being able to think about why the poet might have presented these ideas in the way that she has. Before we look into the poem in any detail, I just want to check that we're all clear about the meaning of the word emigrant versus immigrant, because obviously the title of the poem, The Emigree, is relying on you understanding what an emigree actually is. So an emigrant is a person who leaves his or her country to live in another country. An immigrant, on the other hand, is a person who moves to a new country to live there. So you can see these work as opposites in a way. An emigrant is the person who emigrates, the immigrant is a person who immigrates, an emigrant leaves your country, whereas an immigrant comes to your country. So we really just want to focus on that left-hand side of that table. So we're thinking about an emigree being a female, so it's a feminised version of emigree, being a female emigrant, a person, a woman who leaves her country to live in another country. So a person who has emigrated and had to leave her country behind. So before we then start picking the poem apart, let's make sure that we've all read the poem. So as we're going through this, if you have your copy of the poem in front of you, it's such a good idea to read a poem several times before you start making notes and annotating, because every time you read it, the meaning is going to sink in a little bit more. So it might be that you, after listening to the reading of the poem, you go back and you play it again, or you read it out loud to yourself. But I do encourage you to pause the video and make sure that you've had a couple of experiences of the poem before you listen to me explaining more about it. The Emigree by Rumens.
There once was a country. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear, for it seems I never saw it in that November, which I'm told comes to the mildest city. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright filled paperweight. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I'm branded by an impression of sunlight. The white streets of that city, the graceful slopes, glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks, and the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. That child's vocabulary I carried here, like a hollow doll, opens and spills a grammar. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. It may by now be a lie, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. I have no passport, there's no way back at all, but my city comes to me in its own white plane. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. They accuse me of absence. They circle me. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. My city hides behind me. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight.
We always start by looking at the title, because the title can often frame our understanding of the wider meaning of the poem. So I've already mentioned this word, the emigree, a woman forced to leave her native country, often for political reasons, a displaced person. And it's been feminised with that extra E on the end of the word, because we are to understand that this speaker is a woman. The poem is written in the first person narrative voice, so we have a first person narrator. That means we're experiencing this like somebody who's telling their story. So we've got one character telling us their story, and that helps us as the reader to buy into this being a real story. It gives us this impression that we are living someone's experience with them. And the poem is written in free verse, so that means it doesn't rhyme, it doesn't have a regular rhythm, and alongside the first person narrative voice, that creates this idea of this being quite a conversational poem, like somebody who's telling us their story, a sort of stream of consciousness, somebody sharing their feelings with us. And all of that will then help set up some of the main ideas in the poem, because this is a poem that's describing a child who's forced to leave her homeland and emigrate to another country because of war. And as the reader, we're experiencing the child as a grown-up looking back on that experience. And the poem explores some of the trauma of having to live in exile. It also explores the importance of memory to somebody's sense of identity. And what's interesting about the poem is at no point are we going to be told where this might have happened or even when it might have happened. There's no specific context. And what that means is that this poem can then become a universal experience. It could be about any emigree anywhere in the world at any point in history. And that, I think, is one of the powerful things about the poem, that actually it's just about the empathy that Carol Rumens is giving us in the poem with somebody who might find themselves being displaced from the place in which they were born and initially started to grow up, and how that will be a life-changing experience for them, something that they will never be able to forget. So let's look at a stanza at a time and try and break down the meaning in a little bit more detail. You'll have noticed in the bottom of each slide there's that little book saying literary terms. Where I might be using some of the technical vocabulary to help explain the poem, I've put a definition on the slide to help you. But what you need to remember is that writing about a poem isn't a test as to how many of these technical words you can remember. It's much more important that you understand the effect of these techniques and that you can talk about the meaning and how those techniques create that meaning, even if you can't remember the actual word. Okay, so let's look at that opening then. There once was a country. Now, I wonder if any of you noticed that that could sound a little bit like the opening of a fairy tale, once upon a time, a story that we're all used to hearing as children. And remember, at this point, we're with our speaker remembering their childhood. So it's not an accident that this sounds a bit like a fairy tale. It links to this childlike childhood perspective of this speaker looking back in a dreamlike way about a past that no longer exists, a place that no longer exists, where she initially started to grow up but then had to be taken away from there. So it's very deliberately set up in this kind of sing-song style, if you like, this dreamlike quality that we find in those opening lines. And one of the interesting things in this poem is that because a lot of her memories about the place in which she grew up, this country that she's talking about, are based on a very short time in her childhood, it does make us wonder how much of this is actually real. How much is she imagining? Is she wanting to bring to life in her memories? And maybe it's a little bit idealised and she's not actually remembering some of the more painful facts about the time in which she lived there. There once was a country, and then we've got the ... which is called an ellipsis. And what it's doing in this point in the poem, it's creating what's called a caesura. So it's making us as the reader have to immediately pause. We've only just got into the poem, we're 5 words in, and we're being forced to pause. And her statement, there once was a country, is made to sound like it's trailing off. And what this does is it represents the idea that everything was suddenly ruptured in her childhood. Everything came to an end, just as she was starting to tell us about this fairy tale like childhood existence. Suddenly it's all taken away from her. And if we look at the words that follow, we can see how that works. I left it as a child. So again, we've got this immediate idea of displacement, of someone being taken from somewhere that they didn't want to leave. But, and whenever we see the word but in any text, we know there's something that's going to be offered to us as an alternative, some kind of conflict to that. So I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear. So whilst she might have only been a child for a short time living in this country, what our speaker's telling us straight away really strongly of that statement there is that she still remembers it with clarity, and she uses this image, sunlight clear, to talk about how strong her memories are. And what we're going to notice as we go through this poem is that sunlight and the idea of sun generally is repeatedly used as a motif in the poem. And that sunlight, every time she mentions it, she's talking about her memories of where she grew up, and it represents a kind of warmth like the sun, a vitality, this kind of life-giving, powerful, nostalgic, bright memory that links to that idea of light as being linked to knowledge and moral virtue. So keep looking out for those words to do with sunlight. My memory of it is sunlight clear, for it seems I never saw it in that November, which, I am told, comes to the mildest city. So what we find out here is that as a child, it seems that she doesn't remember, or she wasn't in this country to see the city in autumn, winter, in that November time. So actually, the memories that she has are always summer memories. The sun is always shining. But she's told by these people who we don't know who they are, but presumably family, people who've been exiled with her. She talks about how they've told her in a second-hand way that yes, winter, November, did come to the city, that the sun would have been dispersed by colder weather, but she doesn't remember that. And we get the sense in the poem that she doesn't want to remember the negative things about her city, the things that perhaps were more difficult. She likes the fact that she can only remember the bright times, the good times. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright filled paperweight. Now this is that very same idea again. So the worst news sounds a little bit like something from a television news report, and again we'll see this all the way through the poem, language that suggests how she is appreciating and learning about the news that's linked to where she comes from. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view. So no matter how bad the news is, no matter how bad the things that she learns about what's happening in her country since she's left it, she refuses to let that be stronger than her memory of it, than her original view of her city, her country, which she describes metaphorically as a bright filled paperweight. So again, that word bright we can link to the idea of sunshine, of light, and the moral virtue of something bringing light to a place, but also this metaphor of it being like a paperweight. So a paperweight is something that's used to hold paper down, to stop it being blown around or falling off a desk or something. And the fact that she's now using that metaphor to describe the strength of her memory, that it won't be blown away, that she won't let anything get to it, all adds to this idea of her wanting to hold on tight to these precious memories that she's got. It may be at war, so again, this is what she's hearing through the news, but she doesn't want to be part of that herself. Her country may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. So what we're learning as a reader here is that the country from which she had to emigrate was obviously now a place that's in conflict, is a place that's at war. And she knows this, but she refuses to let that define how she wants to think about her country. She talks about it through personification. She describes the country as if it's sick with tyrants. So the idea of sickness suggesting something that is going to weaken her country, is going to put her country in danger. And what it's sick with is tyrants. Tells us a tyrant is a leader, someone who uses kind of absolute, often cruel power to inflict what they want to happen on the people who live there. So that tyrant, the fact that her country is sick with tyrants, is telling us a lot more about why she might have had to emigrate, that it wasn't safe for her to stay in that country. But in spite of all of that, rather than celebrating the relief that she's managed to escape this place, she's determined to hold on to her memories of it. And when we get to the last line of this first stanza, we have this really strong alliteration with that letter B, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. Now, to brand something, you're kind of burning a mark on something, usually to show ownership, like you might brand cattle, a farmer might brand a cattle to recognise them. So it can be quite a violent word. You can associate this with this little hint that actually there's violence going on in the background of this poem, but she's twisting that round, and what she's saying that she's been branded by is actually the sunlight again. So no matter all the terrible things that she might be hearing about her country and what she knows is happening there, she absolutely is holding on to this mark on her that her country is somewhere that's forever marked as being somewhere that's strong and happy and filled with that warmth and light. So in our second stanza, we go immediately to this image of the white streets of that city. So she's still now talking about her memories of this country, and that image of the streets being white, perhaps literally talk about the kind of architecture of where she came from, but it can also be seen to be another link to that idea of light and moral innocence and truth and those sorts of positive associations. The white streets of that city, the graceful slopes glow even clearer. So we've got some more alliteration there. We've got the graceful and the glow, and we've also, as we go through the enjambment there, we see the lines are broken by that alliteration, graceful on one line and then moving to glow on the next line. What that does is it gives this city this sense of ongoing elegance. She's building up very deliberately this image of her city being somewhere that remains very beautiful, graceful. It's linked with the glowing light again. But then she shows us how it's changed, even clearer, so that the glow becomes even clearer as time rolls its tanks. Now, another metaphor here, the idea of time rolling tanks. We've got sort of the personified idea of time being something that's become aggressive, and tanks obviously being related to a takeover, a military takeover of something, or a defensive position or an attacking position. So everything about her homeland is obviously linked to conflict, but she's constantly trying to pull back from that and show that it doesn't matter what's happening, it doesn't matter how bad it is, her memories of her country are always going to be strongest. So the white streets of that city, the graceful slopes glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us. So it doesn't matter how much time passes since she was last in her country. It doesn't matter how much military action and aggression happens there. She absolutely is holding on to her positive memories. The frontiers, so frontiers suggesting kind of barriers, military barriers that are guarded and show possession, but none of that matters to her. She then moves on to thinking about how that affects her identity through the power of language. That child's vocabulary I carried here, like a hollow doll, opens and spills a grammar. So we're now thinking about, as she's got older, she carried with her, metaphorically carried, this language from her home country. Now, as a child, that language wouldn't have been fully developed. So she gives us this lovely simile of it being like a hollow doll, like a toy, a plaything that isn't filled with anything, because it reflects this idea that she was a child, the playfulness of being a child, but actually she didn't have enough language to really be able to own that language. And what would have happened is, as an emigree, she then would have ended up learning a new language. But she doesn't let that be the thing that defines her. She's showing us that as she's grown up, she's held on to that vocabulary and actually continue to learn that language and possess it as something that's part of her identity. So the hollow doll, as it opens, it spills a grammar. It gives her something that she's able to grasp and use to learn more of the language and then find identity and power through that. And she says, soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. A really hopeful, positive line there, suggesting that she is very close to being able to feel fluent in the language of her original country. And that image of it being a coloured molecule suggests the molecule idea is something that's kind of unshakable, that's going to be the foundation and the basis of her identity. And that coloured, we can again link to that idea of light and something that's beautiful and positive. It may by now be a lie, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. So again, she's reminding us that back in her country, she's conscious, she's aware really that that language that she's holding on to has been banned by the new powers that are controlling her old country, but it doesn't matter to her. She's not going to let that stop her learning the language, and she very defiantly says, but I can't get it off my tongue. And then we have the full stop in the middle of the line again, which creates us another caesura, and that makes us, as the reader at that point, pause at the end of that really powerful rebellious statement. She's giving her language and everything that it links to in terms of her identity strength and defiance against what the state are trying to do to it. And then she ends the stanza by then linking the idea of the language on her tongue, her mother tongue, the language that she was born into. She describes it as tasting like sunlight. So we've got a brilliant sensory image there, talking about taste, not just what things look like. And that ending of the stanza with the word sunlight links back to the motif of light that's going all the way through the poem. And hopefully you've noticed, without me having to tell you, that the last stanza also ended with that word sunlight. Rumens, as a poet, is very deliberately structuring the poem to always end with this really positive and hopeful image. So we're already at the last stanza. And what happens now is we, having learnt about her past, we now start to see the bigger picture of how this experience is impacting on our speaker psychologically. So we start with another statement. I have no passport. Now, if we think about what a passport is, it's official documentation of identity. It's what we're officially given to prove our identity, and it enables us to be able to travel between countries and to have kind of status wherever you are about where you've come from. So an official document that symbolises in a way what our identity is. She's saying that she has no passport to prove her belonging, her sense of belonging to this country. And that's something from which she says there's no way back at all. Yet what this poem seems to be showing, though, is that in spite of not having a passport, in spite of not having that official physical thing, she still has got emotional access back to her country. Her identity is still going to be linked to that country, and that's what this poem is celebrating, that you might take away the official and the legal documentation, but you will never take away the part of her identity and spirit that's founded in where she's come from. So there's a very powerful feeling about the concept of home in this poem. I have no passport. There's no way back at all. But, notice that word but coming up again in this poem, but my city, so she's owning her city here, my city comes to me in its own white plain. Now it's clearly a metaphor. We've got the white plain like we had the white street, so we can look at the colour imagery and the connotations of innocence and purity there again, but also this idea of a plane linking back to the passport of something that can kind of fly between countries and enable travel. Now, the other thing that this reminds us of is a child playing with a paper aeroplane, which links back to this idea that she was a child when she left the country, and a lot of her messages and memories are quite childlike. And this plane, as it flies in, lies down in front of her. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. So it's something totally unthreatening that she has got playful control over. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. It's almost like it's morphed into a pet or something here, but the point is that her memories of the city are very intimate, is something that she wants to protect and look after, care for, and in her sort of dreams, in her imagination, that's exactly what she does. She treasures this little pure, innocent, playful image of her city and everything that it means to her. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. So we've got an iambic pentameter there, which describes the rhythm of that line, but it reflects the idea of the poem lifting with this sort of energetic image of her imagining that she's metaphorically dancing through the city with her city. So that's important because what happens next totally changes the mood again. So we go from this very kind of upbeat image of her city coming to her as if in a dream and taking her dancing, but then something changes again. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. So we have that enjambment, so we get city and then the next line flows into it and we suddenly realise that we've got walls. Now walls can definitely have connotations of separation, of barriers, of being stopped from getting somewhere. What's really not so clear at the end of this poem is where this city is now. Does she mean her city from her childhood is a city of walls, or is she now talking about the new city, the city to which she has emigrated? Is that a city of walls? So let's look at what happens next and see what we can make of this. They accuse me of absence. They circle me. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. My city hides behind me. They mutter death. Now I deliberately emphasise that word they, hopefully you could hear that, because that repetition is obviously there very purposefully. So Carol Rumens is deliberately choosing to repeat that word they, and the word they is anonymous. We don't really know who they are, and it creates this very strong sense of them, of us, of her as the speaker, seeming quite vulnerable to who these people are. They accuse me of absence. They circle me. Now, we can read this as if she's in her old city, where in her imagination she's gone dancing through the city. She's ended up suddenly finding herself trapped in that new city, being accused of absence, perhaps suggesting that she has guilt, that she left there and presumably left people who would have been friends, maybe even family, to experience whatever was about to happen. So we could read that what's happening here is that she's experiencing guilt that she left her homeland and left people there to be victims to the war that was ensuing. They accuse me of absence. They circle me. Being circled is definitely a feeling of being trapped, encircled, unable to get out. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. Now this line's a little bit more confusing, and some people then think that maybe the end of this poem is not her old city that she's talking about that's become the city of walls. It's actually the place where she's emigrated, and what's happening instead is that she is being accused of not really belonging in the place where she's emigrated to. And some people have even read into this that maybe this idea of being accused of being dark in their free city is linked to the racism that a lot of emigrants would experience when they moved somewhere else, where they're displaced somewhere else. There is no right answer to this. We don't know the answer, and the great thing about English literature is that you can make your own decision, or you can sit between those two readings and choose which one, or whether you want to explore both of them when you're writing about the poem. It's absolutely okay to decide that you're not sure of the reading and explore both of them, but it's really worth some extra reading and some thinking around this so you feel like you've got a reading that sits nicely with you. What happens next is she describes her city as hiding behind her. So is the city hiding behind her because she's in the new version of the city and the city, her old city, is uncomfortable with that? Or is it that she's in her new country and the memory of her city is hiding behind her because it doesn't really belong there? Such an interesting discussion to have. They mutter death. Now, as soon as we have that word death, we obviously feel the threat, the opposition to all the light and the idealism in the poem. But she doesn't end with that, because this is a poem that's absolutely positive and optimistic every time we come to the end of a stanza. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. Now we've got the sort of juxtaposition here of sunlight and a shadow, sort of dark and light, but of course you need to have light to be able to have a shadow. So this final image is really clever. What she seems to be saying is that even when threatened, even with her city cowering behind her, casting this shadow, she sees that as a positive thing, because it's evidence that there must be sunlight somewhere, that to have a shadow there's always been light, there's always something that's positive and optimistic, and a memory of how powerful that childhood is to her, and it can never be taken away from the person that she is. So we can bring the poem to a conclusion by thinking about this being a poem about the power of identity, that whilst conflict can cause pain and trauma in exile, actually that displacement, that physical, geographical displacement, can never actually take away someone's sense of identity and the memories that they cling on to. Now, this is Carol Rumens, and she has been quoted as saying about this poem, the poem is about the conflict between imagination and convention. The speaker is an inner emigree, not politically, but emotionally. Now, you don't need to quote from her when you're writing about the poem, but I think this is quite helpful when we're thinking about what the poem's about, that whilst there obviously is a political story behind her speaker, what Carol Rumens is saying is that what she's interested in the poem is the emotional experience of being displaced from your homeland, the emotional turmoil and the conflict that can create, how memory can be both powerful, but perhaps that nostalgia can play tricks on you and mean that living a future somewhere different can actually be quite confusing and have reassurances, but also have further concerns. It can affect memory, it can affect love, it can affect identity, and that displacement is something that will never leave you. And what might help you to understand that a little bit more is to know a little bit about Carol Rumens. So she wrote this poem in the 90s when around the world globally, as with now, there would have been a lot of examples of people who were being displaced by war and conflict. So that's something that she absolutely would have been very conscious of. She also has a very personal fascination with elsewhere. She's translated Russian poems that have dealt with similar themes. She's worked with poems that have come from Eastern Europe in particular, where actually the writing was banned, and she's worked at trying to translate even smuggling work around the country to try and make sure that that writing can be shared. So she is quite a political character, but quietly with an interest more in the emotional impact of what it's like to be displaced from somewhere. So that, if we think about our AO3, our context, can help us understand why the poem is written the way it is. It's a conflict in the speaker's heart. It's a conflict of memory more than it's about a geographical, political conflict. And it's a poem about our perceptions of war-torn countries perhaps being different to the people who live there, because whilst we might look at the news and see a country that's absolutely being torn apart by conflict and think, well, you know, that's terrible, why would anyone want to live there? If you're the person who grew up there, even if you are forced to leave, that doesn't mean that you are going to live the rest of your life not looking back fondly and wishing sometimes that you could be back in that place that is so grounded who you are and your experience of life and your language and how you feel about things. So when we're thinking about how to compare this with other poems in the anthology, we've got lots of options and ways into them. This is just a selection, so don't see this list as the only way that you can compare poems. It's just to get you thinking. So we could look at Shelley's Ozymandias, because both poets explore the passing of time and the impact of tyranny on the passing of time. So both talk about tyrants and their absolute power, trying to control, yet never really being able to control human emotion. In Prelude, the Wordsworth poem, we've got narrators who are both experiencing kind of simultaneous fear, but also being in awe of something they can't control. So that's a really interesting comparison. In Charge of the Light Brigade by Tennyson, they might seem absolutely different in subject matter, but actually both poems are celebrating human resilience and what a human can cope with and find something positive in. In Armitage's Remains, both poems portray that sense of an inner conflict and the power of the mind and memory. In Poppies by Jane Weir, both are exploring nostalgia and loss, and nostalgia, that memory, looking back on something in a fond way with some sadness. So that's another interesting angle there. And then Tissue, Darker, both poems explore identity and the strength of humanity, the strength of individuals, and how that identity is such a central part of who we are as humans. There's also, really interestingly, that shared use of light as imagery, and both have this very positive conclusion in spite of covering some quite sad, difficult themes. Now, AGAR's checking out my history. Hopefully you can really quickly see how both poets are celebrating cultural identity and that there's power in claiming your identity through a rebellion against anyone who's tried to oppress you. And finally, in Kamikaze by Garland, the power of memory and a sense of belonging, both really interesting themes that are pulled out differently but with common threads if you look at those two poems together. So I really hope that's helped you with your understanding of the Emigree by Carol Rumens. You should now, for AO1, have an understanding of the main events, the themes and the tone of the poem. Hopefully for AO2 you've got some ideas about how you could pull out particular quotes, talk about the structure and the form of the poem and how that's helping with us as the reader understanding the main ideas. And finally, I've talked a little bit about how the time in which the poem was written and what we know about the poet might help us see how these themes and ideas have come into existence.